The clouds over Glacier 7 swirled like ancient ghosts, thick with frost and thunderous silence. From the orbiting dome of the Intergalactic Survival Academy, the icy planet looked serene, smooth as a pearl, motionless, beautiful, and utterly lethal. Its surface temperature dipped far below what most life forms could endure without advanced protection, and for that reason alone, it had been chosen as the final testing ground. Inside the Academy's cold, metallic hall, cadets from 16 star systems stood at attention beneath the jagged glass ceiling. Above them, Glacier 7 rotated in solemn silence, casting a dim blue glow onto the floor. Some students were humanoid, others gelatinous or crystalline, but all of them wore the dark gray training uniform of the Academy. In the middle of the line stood a human cadet, Jack Ronan, tall, quiet, and often underestimated. His uniform was just as gray, but he was the only one sweating slightly in the neck from the heat of the room. Earthborn bodies still hadn't fully adjusted to the Academy's regulated humidity. Professor Tharn emerged from the side chamber. His tall, translucent body rippled with soft waves of lavender light as he walked. He was an amphibious being from Kaltar Prime, with 4 long limbs and 2 sets of pupilless eyes that moved independently. His voice was melodic yet commanding, a sound that echoed more in the brain than in the ears. "Cadets," he began, "today you will complete the final component of your field survival training. You have studied the principles of shelter construction in a variety of hostile environments. Now, you will demonstrate what you've learned in the most unforgiving conditions our galaxy has to offer." There was a pause, as if he enjoyed the building tension. "You will be dropped individually on Glacier 7. Each of you will be assigned a different drop zone within 1 square kilometer of the abandoned Terran survey crash site. You will construct a shelter using only what the environment provides. No external tech, no digital fabrication. Your bodysuits will provide only minimal protection until nightfall. If you fail to complete your shelter in time, the planet will kill you. Any use of emergency beacons will result in point deduction. This is not just about survival, it is about ingenuity." He stopped walking and looked directly at Jack with all 4 eyes for a moment. Jack didn't flinch, but he could feel the scrutiny. Tharn always had a way of making him feel like an exhibit in a zoo, something fascinating and yet fragile. "You have 10 standard hours. Your suits will track vitals and cognitive response. If you complete the night alive and functional, you pass. If you thrive, you may earn honors. If you fail, well, no one fails twice." The students were dismissed with a sharp nod. One by one, they filed out of the hall and toward the transport bays. Jack followed silently, his pack slung over his shoulder, feeling the weight of the moment settle onto his shoulders like snowfall. He knew the test wouldn't be easy. Glacier 7 was no ordinary ice world. With wind gusts that could shear metal, snowfall like powdered glass, and surface temperatures that dropped to minus 120 degrees Celsius by midnight, this planet didn't forgive poor planning. As the transport shuttle hummed to life and began its descent, Jack looked out the small viewport. The clouds were so thick that they seemed to peel back like curtains as the shuttle pierced them. He could see flashes of the terrain, sharp ridges of ice, snow-drifted plateaus, the twisted metal bones of what used to be a Terran exploration pod from a forgotten age. "Prepare for drop," came the automated voice. He stood, clipped his helmet in place, and stepped into the drop capsule. The door sealed, enclosing him in darkness. Then, without warning, gravity vanished, then slammed back as the pod launched. He felt the harsh descent in his chest, the vibration in his bones. Then impact. The pod hissed open and the cold hit him like a wall. Jack stumbled out, bracing against the shrieking wind, his boots crunching on crystallized snow. The terrain was white, endless, broken only by jagged shadows and the skeletons of crashed ships buried half in the ice. His assigned location was the northeastern edge of the crash site. Other cadets would land in different directions, each isolated by protocol. Jack immediately took stock of his surroundings. His breath fogged his visor, and he adjusted the filter to compensate. The suit's AI spoke in his ear. "Warning, ambient temperature 104 degrees Celsius. Recommend shelter construction within 3 hours." Jack nodded to himself. He tapped the small screen on his wrist, marking the time. 9 hours and 52 minutes to sunset. He scanned the area, noting the positions of wind currents, the snow's depth, and the potential for avalanche. No caves, no overhangs, no ready-made shelters. That meant it was going to be a long day. Far in the distance, a crumpled metallic shape caught his eye. Jack trudged forward, each step an effort, and arrived at the remains of a survey drone, one of the old Terran models from nearly a century ago. Its panels were bent and blackened, half-eaten by rust and snow, but he could see that some of the components were still intact. His mouth tightened into a line. Most cadets would ignore this. It wasn't technically part of the environment, but according to the challenge, anything within the natural crash zone was fair game. He pried open a frozen panel and found a tangle of wires and something even better, a solar battery unit, cracked but possibly usable. A grin flickered across his face. His fingers moved quickly, pulling out lengths of lightweight paneling, thin copper tubing, and even some flexible alloy sheets that could be bent and shaped. These materials, while ancient, had been designed to survive deep space environments. If he could repurpose them, they would be better than anything else on the frozen surface. He worked for hours, his movements deliberate, methodical. With the alloy sheets, he began to form a rough dome, using shards of transparent solar plastic to serve as a makeshift skylight. He dug deep into the snow for a base, creating a natural insulator beneath the floor. Then he buried the floor panels under a layer of powdered snow and compacted it with his boots, layering it like bricks. The wind grew harsher, the sun dimmed behind the thickening clouds. Time was running out. He connected the remains of the solar battery to a basic heating coil he made from salvaged copper wire. He set the coil beneath a stack of black rock he'd collected, rocks that retained and radiated heat better than anything else around. The idea was simple. Store the sun's heat during the day, release it through the night. He used strips of fabric from his emergency kit to seal the edges of the structure, preventing cold air from slipping through the seams. As the temperature plummeted further, Jack crouched inside the dome, now fully enclosed, and checked the battery. It hummed weakly, but it worked. He adjusted the coil's settings and waited. Slowly, the interior temperature began to rise. It was barely above freezing, but compared to the deathly cold outside, it felt like spring. Outside, the wind screamed louder, a banshee across the plains. Inside the dome, Jack sat cross-legged, lit by the faint orange glow of the battery core, and pulled a ration bar from his pack. It was going to be a long night, but he'd made something out of nothing, and it was only the beginning. The morning sky above Glacier 7 remained unchanged, gray, wind-scoured, and dim as ever. But on the ground, the challenge had fully awakened. Across the kilometer-wide crash zone, cadets from the Intergalactic Survival Academy were locked into a focused silence, each of them working through the terrain in isolation. No contact was allowed during the exam period, but the unspoken tension lingered like static in the air. Each student had landed in a separate segment, far enough apart to ensure no interference, but not so far that they couldn't be observed remotely by the surveillance drones. The exam was not merely about staying alive, it was about how each cadet approached the problem, how each decision reflected training, instinct, and originality. Cadet Glar was one of the first to begin constructing. His insectoid body moved quickly over the snow, clawed limbs slicing through ice as if it were paper. He had chosen a raised slope for his shelter, a place shielded slightly from the east winds. Using curved plates of ice cut with his natural arm blades, he built a half-domed structure, reinforcing it with secretions from his thorax that hardened into a glossy resin. His kind, native to the acidic plains of Norvalk IR, were experts in hive engineering. Glar worked with the assurance of a species that had survived countless extinction events. A few ridges away, Velka moved with fluid grace. The crystalline cadet shimmered in the dim light as she assembled angular pillars of rock and translucent panels. She communicated to her own internal temperature regulators, using sound pulses to adjust frequency resonance in the material she shaped. Her species had long used vibration to stabilize crystalline structures in hostile conditions. She sang to the stones in low harmonic tones, and slowly, a jagged, tent-like prism emerged from the frost. Her shelter caught and refracted light, bouncing residual solar energy toward its core. Another student, Zarn of the Kulari, dug deep into the snow, using his triple-jointed arms to carve a tunnel that spiraled beneath the surface. The Kulari evolved on methane-rich ice moons, where subterranean warmth kept their colonies alive. For him, digging downward was as natural as breathing. As he vanished beneath the snowdrifts, Only the occasional puff of white mist marked his progress. Throughout the zone, students employed their evolutionary advantages and homeworld techniques. Some created windbreak walls from fused gravel. Others erected domes using gravity stabilizers from the Debrief fields. All of them used what they knew, what they had been taught, what their cultures had passed down over centuries of survival. Jack, however, had no cultural blueprint for this world. Earth was a place of oceans and forests, cities and deserts, but nothing like the frostbitten silence of Glacius 7. What he did have was an eye for patterns and a stubborn refusal to fail. He had finished the outer shell of his dome before the others even realized he had found the old survey wreckage. While the rest of the cadets focused on structural integrity, Jack focused on efficiency. Inside his shelter, the air was tolerable now, the temperature rising steadily as his heating coil gathered and redistributed energy. But he knew it wouldn't last long, unless he made the system smarter. Outside the shelter, he had already set up 3 flat alloy panels at an angle to catch the limited solar rays filtering through the clouds. The panels absorbed what little warmth the sun offered, directing it into the battery unit he had salvaged and reinforced with spare thermal cells found in a secondary probe husk. He had tested the connections twice. The meter blinked faintly, functional, barely. Satisfied for the moment, he emerged from the shelter to scan the terrain again. The wind lashed across his visor, tugging at the seams of his suit. He knelt beside the nearest snowbank and began carving narrow trenches, forming a pattern in the shape of a wide X leading outward from the shelter's base. The design wasn't decorative, it was practical. As the wind whipped through the trenches, it would push powder snow away from the dome, rather than letting it build up against the walls. It was a simple snowdrift deflector. Nothing elegant, but it could mean the difference between a buried exit and a safe way out in case of emergency. As he worked, he noticed a shape on the far edge of his sector. Tall, blocky, and flickering with failed light. Another drone husk. He moved toward it without hesitation. When he reached it, he could see that most of the internal components had long since been destroyed. However, a single panel of thermal shielding remained partially intact. He pried it free using a broken strut from the side of the wreck and carried it back over his shoulder, slipping only once on a patch of hidden ice. Back at the dome, he added the panel above the entrance, creating a double-layer flap to trap more heat. He reinforced it with lines of fiber cable pulled from an antenna coil, anchoring it into the snow and sealing the gaps with frost-hardened paste from his utility kit. Every movement was purposeful. He didn't rush. He didn't waste time admiring the view or checking on what others were building. That wasn't part of the task. Still, high above, drones hovered silently, capturing his progress along with everyone else's. Inside the orbiting Academy station, Professor Tharn watched from the central command room. His eyes moved independently across multiple screens. He monitored cadet vitals, structural scans, energy consumption, stress levels. What he saw from Jack's sector puzzled him. The human had chosen debris over natural material. His vitals remained stable, his heartbeat was elevated only slightly, and his mental activity displayed an unusual pattern, focused but erratically creative. One of the assistant instructors, a neural symbiote from Yalara, leaned toward the display. "He's not using the planet at all," she said with mild disapproval. Professor Tharn's upper eyes narrowed. "He's using what the planet offered to those who were careless enough to crash on it. That counts." The assistant hesitated but said nothing more. Back on the surface, Jack sat inside his dome, legs crossed, looking over his notes. His gloved hand held a thin strip of metal which he slowly bent into a circular ring. It wasn't necessary for survival. It was a test. He wanted to see if the temperature distribution from the floor was even. He placed the ring in the center, marked the position of shadows on his wristpad, and waited. As the sun dipped lower, the light grew faint, and he checked the solar battery one more time. It was at 47% capacity, enough to maintain warmth for several hours if he kept consumption minimal. He wrapped insulation foil around the inner walls, held in place with melted ice and pressure clips, then adjusted the intake flap to allow limited airflow without wind entry. The system was basic, but it mimicked the greenhouse effect. Trap what you have, lose nothing. Then he did something no other cadet was doing. He took out a small water pack, broke the heat tab inside, and poured it into a collapsible kettle. He placed it atop the warm rock plate above the coil and waited. Steam rose slowly. When the first scent of hydration filled the air, he smiled faintly. There would be no real tea, of course, but hot water was enough. It reminded him that he was human, and sometimes the simplest comforts were the ones that mattered most. Outside, the wind howled with rising intensity. The first major gusts of night began sweeping across the plain, throwing grit and snow into the air like a storm of needles. Far off, structures began groaning. A crystalline wall cracked. A snow mound partially collapsed. Voices echoed in the dark, sharp with alert signals and emergency reconfiguration. Inside his dome, Jack reached into his pack, pulled out a ration tablet, and bit into it without ceremony. He wasn't hungry, but he needed energy. He adjusted the interior light to low amber, checked the seal around the entry flap again, and finally let himself lean back. The test wasn't over. Night hadn't yet reached its coldest point, but he had done what needed to be done. Now, it would be a matter of endurance, and whether the others had built something that would hold up when the storm hit its peak. He had a feeling many wouldn't. The dim amber glow inside the shelter pulsed softly, casting elongated shadows against the metallic curves of the interior. Jack lay back with his head resting on the bundled fabric of his spare thermal layer, one hand under his head, the other loosely gripping a heat tab that he rolled between his fingers. The storm outside had intensified. Wind slapped against the dome like waves against a ship's hull, each gust followed by a whispering tremble through the frame. Jack listened, analyzing the pattern of sound, the consistency of pressure, the frequency of impacts. Everything told him the storm had reached its midpoint. It would get worse before it passed. He sat up slowly and adjusted the intake flap just slightly. Too little oxygen, and he risked cognitive fatigue. Too much, and he would invite the freezing air to undo all his work. He narrowed the opening by a few millimeters, then taped the edge with a strip of salvage cloth soaked in a gel-like sealing compound. He pressed along the seam with his knuckles, ensuring a tight bond, then sat back again. His breath escaped in small clouds before fading into the warmth now held within the dome. On his left, the kettle still radiated gentle heat. He poured the remaining hot water into his cup, savoring the steam on his face. The scent was faint, almost non-existent, but the psychological comfort made a difference. He checked the power core, down to 30%, but holding steady. The heating coil flickered weakly, still glowing beneath the stacked rocks. He opened his utility pad and brought up the shelter's internal diagnostics. He hadn't been required to monitor or measure performance, but Jack always preferred to quantify results. Temperature was holding at 8 degrees Celsius. Wind pressure against the eastern wall had increased by 19% since the last scan. Humidity was steady, oxygen just slightly below optimal. He noted each reading with the same care as if the data would be presented before a military tribunal. Then he turned off the diagnostics. The numbers wouldn't matter now. What mattered was the shelter doing its job for the next few hours. He had time, and he needed to think. He reached behind him and retrieved the circular metal ring he had placed on the floor earlier. It had shifted slightly, barely, but it had. That confirmed the uneven distribution of floor temperature. Heat was escaping faster toward the rear side, possibly due to a microfracture in the alloy panel beneath. He would need to patch that, but not tonight. It was minor. For now, it could wait. His thoughts drifted, consciously but not aimlessly. He considered the others, scattered across the wasteland beyond his dome. He imagined Glar crouched in a mound of his own resin, wings folded to trap body heat, antennae twitching for vibrations. He imagined Velka, her crystalline lattice structure perhaps humming low-frequency vibrations, sustaining herself by kinetic resonance. He had no illusions that he was the strongest, the fastest, or even the most intelligent in the academy. But he did know this. No one else here had been forced to survive using scraps. No one else had learned to build something functional out of leftovers and ruins. Earth had taught him that long before the Academy had. A sudden metallic thud interrupted his thoughts. It came from outside, followed by a faint grinding sound. Jack froze, listening carefully. Another thump. Not the wind, not icefall, something heavier. He crawled to the door flap and shut off the interior light. Silence followed. Then another muffled impact, closer this time. He opened the flap slowly, peering out. In the distance, he could make out a dark, shifting shape moving low to the ground. At first, he thought it might be a large piece of debris blown loose, tumbling across the snow, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw that it was a cadet. Someone crawling on hands and knees, struggling against the wind. The movement was erratic, disoriented. Whoever it was had lost control of body temperature, or perhaps oxygen flow. The storm was throwing the figure sideways with each step. Jack knew what he was seeing. A shelter must have failed. Someone had abandoned their structure and tried to reach another location. That was forbidden unless ordered via emergency protocol, but sometimes desperation made rules irrelevant. He didn't hesitate. He pulled on his helmet and sealed the visor, activated the secondary heating layer in his suit, and keyed the emergency override code into the pad embedded near the entry. The door hissed open. Wind howled inside, instantly dropping the interior temperature by several degrees. He moved fast, stepping into the storm, snow clawing at his suit and dragging at his boots. Visibility dropped to 10 meters almost immediately, and he had to rely on the flicker of movement ahead to guide him. He reached the fallen cadet after what felt like a full minute of trudging. The figure was small, wrapped in a torn cape. Her suit's lighting system blinked erratically, and one of her gloves was missing. He recognized her face through the cracked visor. Nira Vel, the youngest cadet in the academy and one of the top theoretical minds. Her crystalline oxygen converter had ruptured, and ice was forming along the edges of her lips. Jack didn't speak. He knew her auditory sensors were likely malfunctioning. Instead, he lifted her onto his shoulder, adjusted her weight, and turned back toward the dome. Every step back was harder. The wind resisted him, trying to push him down, bury him. His balance shifted with the added weight, and twice he slipped, falling onto one knee before dragging himself upright again. When he reached the dome, his entrance had partially collapsed. Snow had drifted against the wall, burying the trench. He didn't stop. He kicked through it, cleared the path with one arm while holding Nira against his side, then crawled in. He shut the flap behind him and activated the internal seal. It took a moment for the system to repressurize. He laid her down on the inner mat and began checking her vitals. Her body temperature was critically low. He removed her cracked helmet, secured a thermal wrap around her torso, and activated one of his last two emergency heat tabs. He placed it directly against her spine. Slowly, her shivering began. She blinked, disoriented. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. He nodded at her and gently pressed her shoulder. "You're all right," he said quietly. "You made it." She didn't answer. Her eyes closed again, but her breathing stabilized. He wrapped a second layer of insulation around her and shifted her toward the inner side of the dome, away from the intake flap. The heating coil was still functioning. The battery, now at 22%, was draining faster. He knew that by saving her, he had halved his margin of error. But he didn't regret it. Not once. He resealed the flap and reinforced it with an extra plate of insulation. The dome groaned again under pressure, but the structure held. Inside, it was warmer now. More bodies, more retained heat. He checked the diagnostics again. Oxygen levels had dropped but remained within range. He could manage this. He had to. He sat down beside her, breathing slowly, letting his own pulse settle. His hands were shaking now, not from cold, but from the sheer exertion. He had burned through more energy in the last 10 minutes than in the entire afternoon. He closed his eyes for a moment and tried to rest. A faint chime from his pad pulled him out of the near sleep. The Academy's internal surveillance system had logged an anomaly. He checked the message. Professor Tharn had overridden the monitoring protocol. The message was brief. "Unregistered contact detected in your sector. Report acknowledged. No penalty incurred." Jack deleted the message. He didn't care about rules right now. He glanced back at Nira. She was asleep, her breathing steady. The storm outside howled, but inside the dome, the human-made structure continued to hold, shielding both of them. He looked at the glowing coil, now flickering weaker with every cycle, and knew he would have to make another decision soon. But not yet. For now, the shelter had done its job. It had become more than just a test. It had become a lifeline. The low whine of wind outside no longer sounded like weather. It resembled something ancient and alive, furious, unrelenting, intelligent in the way predators were. Each gust against the dome seemed more deliberate than the last, like a test of patience and structural resolve. Jack sat beside the heating coil, his back against the inner curve of the shelter, hands pressed to his knees as he forced himself to stay calm. The temperature had dipped another 2 degrees in the last hour. He watched the number settle on the screen, 6 degrees Celsius. Still survivable, but there wasn't much slack left. Nira shifted slightly in her wrap, her brow furrowing in discomfort. Her cheeks had regained a trace of color, and the trembling had slowed. Her body was doing the work of warming itself now, but she was still fragile. Her visor lay cracked near the wall, a thin smear of frost lining the fracture. Jack had already sealed her suit with thermal patches and repurposed strips from the lining of his emergency vest. If she regained consciousness for more than a few seconds, she'd still be groggy. Her mind had probably endured some neural fog from oxygen depletion. He didn't speak to her again. She wasn't ready yet. He checked the battery core, 19%. The flickering in the coil had grown more frequent. He had maybe 2 hours of moderate heat left if he kept usage low. Stretching it longer would require sacrifice. He stared at the screen for a long time before closing the panel. Numbers had brought him this far, but instinct would have to take over now. He reached behind the heat plate and slowly twisted the coil's regulator down by 30%. The effect was immediate. The dome dimmed slightly. Heat output lowered to a level that made the air noticeably cooler but not unbearable. He zipped his collar to the chin and rubbed his gloved hands together. He would conserve what he could for her sake. The wind hit again, harder this time, a solid strike like a palm slapping metal. The dome shuddered. Jack rose instantly, pressed his hand to the support strut nearest the sound and waited. The frame held. His breath caught in his throat, not from fear but from calculation. If the wind had shifted direction, it would place more pressure on the eastern side, where the entrance was reinforced only with a salvaged thermal plate. He retrieved a bundle of flexible tubing from the supply crate, wrapped it around his arm, and crawled toward the flap. Once there, he pulled back the seal and felt the full brunt of the outside chill grip his skin through the suit. Ice crystals darted in like knives. He pushed the tubing into the outer gap between the plate and the dome shell, wrapping it around the anchor points and binding the seams with a gel that hardened immediately. He worked quickly, biting down on his tongue to keep focused. When finished, he resealed the flap and knelt by the entrance, monitoring the vibration. The next gust came, louder, but the shift was minimal. The seal held. He exhaled and crawled back inside. He glanced at Nira again. Her breathing had steadied into a slow rhythm, a good sign. The wrap was still secure. He tapped the inner wall above her to test its warmth. It was cool now, borderline cold, but not freezing. He leaned his head against the alloy and closed his eyes for 10 seconds, no more. When he opened them, he reached into his satchel and pulled out the last ration packet. He broke it open, tore off a strip of protein, and chewed it slowly. He would have to ration the rest for both of them if the storm continued longer than expected. In the distance, an unfamiliar sound cut through the wind. A rising hum, mechanical and hollow. Jack stiffened. It was no natural noise. He crawled back to the entrance, peeled a small viewport open in the upper flap and peered out. Far beyond the dome, across a slope of snow and ice, he spotted a vertical streak of pulsing orange light. A distress beacon. Someone else had activated theirs. He clenched his jaw. That beacon wouldn't bring help right away. It was part of the test, meant to mark emergency locations for the debrief, but not for live retrieval, unless confirmed fatal. The Academy wanted students to struggle, to fail under real conditions. That beacon meant another shelter had failed, possibly more than one. He considered going out again, but even as the idea formed, he dismissed it. He couldn't abandon Nira. The cold outside would sap too much energy. He had already pushed the limits once. A second retrieval might be a fatal mistake. Still, the knowledge of someone else freezing in the storm carved at his conscience. He shut the viewport and sealed the flap again, moving away without comment. Time passed slowly. He didn't sleep. Instead, he used his remaining alertness to scan for weaknesses. He rotated the shelter's internal configuration slightly, shifting 2 support struts from one wall to another to redistribute pressure. He ran diagnostics again, logging data into his pad, not because he had to, but because it helped him stay sharp. Thinking was survival. He also studied Nira's face. She was no longer the stoic, brilliant cadet everyone saw in the training chambers. Here she looked young, human in a way most of the Academy had forgotten to be. He had never spoken much to her before. Her grades were unmatched in navigation and theory. He remembered once seeing her correct a professor's equation mid-lecture with such precision that even the AI monitoring system had paused. She had done it without pride, without condescension, just calm correction. That kind of mind didn't deserve to freeze in the snow. She stirred again. Her eyes fluttered open. This time she focused. "Where?" she rasped, barely audible. He leaned forward, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe. You're inside my shelter. I found you crawling." She blinked, then slowly nodded. Her throat was too dry for words. Reached for the canteen, poured a capful of water and held it to her lips. She drank in silence. After a moment, she exhaled softly. "Your shelter," she whispered. "It's warm." He allowed himself a faint smile. Warm enough. She fell asleep again, but the connection had been made. She was awake, aware. That meant she would live. He exhaled through his nose, releasing tension he hadn't realized he'd been holding for hours. Outside, the wind began to lessen, not by much, but enough that the walls didn't quake as violently. He checked the time. 2 hours until sunrise. The worst of the night was ending. He moved to the center of the dome, adjusted the heating coil slightly upward, and watched the glow intensify. The battery would barely last. 15% remained. But he'd timed it well. The storm was retreating. Soon, the first rays of Glacia's distant sun would creep over the horizon. With the end of darkness would come the recall signal from the Academy. Extraction would follow. But he wasn't thinking about the end. He was thinking about what had happened in the quiet between gusts, the moment he had made a choice not required by any test, a choice to share his shelter, his heat, his energy, and his safety with another student. He hadn't done it for reward or recognition. He had done it because the dome he built wasn't just a shelter, it was a second chance. Not just for her. For him, too. He leaned against the inner wall and watched the dull sky through the translucent patch above. Soon it would brighten. Soon someone would notice. But for now, he was content to sit in the silence of his own design, with a cadet he barely knew sleeping safely nearby, and a storm that had failed to break him. The light broke slowly over Glacia 7, not in beams or streaks, but in a slow bleeding of pale blue across the jagged horizon. The snow reflected it without warmth, without ceremony. It just was. The end of night. Marked not by triumph, but by survival. Jack blinked through the frost-ringed visor of his helmet. He had opened the upper flap of the dome hours ago, allowing some of the cold in exchange for a clearer view of the sky. The sun, distant and dim, now hovered low, giving just enough illumination for the signal flare he had planted in the snow to become visible from orbit. The extraction sequence had begun 20 minutes earlier. A soft vibration through the ground had warned him first, subtle but unmistakable. The sound of approaching craft came next, like thunder trapped beneath the ice. He had remained still, watching Nira breathe. Her chest rose evenly. Her hands were no longer clutched in the anxious fists of unconscious distress. She slept now like someone recovering, not someone fleeing death. He rose slowly, feeling every muscle complain. His joints cracked inside the suit, his back ached from the crouched hours. But he didn't allow himself to stretch or sigh. There would be time for that later. He moved around the interior one last time, checking the seams, the coil, the battery. Only 4% power remained. The heater had lasted longer than he expected, but not by much. It was nearly spent. Still, the dome stood, scarred, patched, and frostbitten, but standing. He crouched beside Nira and gently touched her arm. Her eyes fluttered open, and this time, when she looked at him, recognition was immediate. "We made it?" she asked, her voice hoarse but steady. He nodded. "Extraction will be here in 5 minutes." She looked around, taking in the dome fully for the first time. Her gaze passed over the heating coil, the reinforced walls, the patched seams, and the makeshift insulation. She blinked at it all, then at him. "You built this out of trash." He didn't smile, but his eyes showed the trace of amusement. "Recycled materials," he corrected. She shook her head faintly. "You built it for yourself." "But you shared it. Why?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Because you would have died." That didn't answer the question. He didn't respond right away. The wind outside had softened into a dull whisper, and the silence inside felt strangely intimate now that survival was no longer the only focus. He looked at her directly. "Because if I'd left you out there, I would have carried it longer than the exhaustion." She held his gaze, then nodded once. "Thank you," she said quietly. Before he could answer, the ground beneath them trembled more forcefully. A series of sharp metallic impacts echoed from outside. The retrieval transport had landed. He stood, reached down, and helped her to her feet. She swayed, and he steadied her. "Lean on me until we're aboard," he said. She nodded. Together they pushed open the flap. The sunlight struck her first, and she winced behind the glare of her helmet's cracked lens. He stepped in front of her to block the worst of it and led her out. The retrieval team didn't speak. They were automatons, tall, skeletal, and indifferent. Their single task was collection. One extended a scanner and logged Jack's ID. Another retrieved nearer and placed her gently onto a mobile med sled. A third drone began scanning the dome behind them, recording its structure from top to base. Before the flap closed, Jack turned back and looked at the shelter one final time. The entrance he had reinforced with spare tubing, the dome's skewed curve shaped by scavenged alloy, the heating coil that had glowed for nearly 12 hours. It looked ugly, crude, but it had worked. And more than that, it had protected more than one life. He followed the drone toward the ship. Inside, he took a seat and strapped himself in beside Nira, who had already been given hydration and a stabilizing patch. Her eyes were closed, but her hand rested on the edge of the stretcher, and her fingers brushed his arm once, lightly. He didn't move away. The ship ascended silently, the ground pulling away until Glacius 7 looked distant again, pale and flat and deceptively peaceful. The trip back to the academy took less than an hour, but it felt longer. No one spoke. The cadets who had failed to build adequate shelters were already aboard, some asleep, others wrapped in medical blankets. One was still unconscious, with a neural crown scanning his brain activity in real time. Jack didn't recognize him. He hoped he would recover. When the doors opened, the cadets were led one by one into the debriefing hall. Professor Tharn stood at the center of the room, arms folded behind his back, his four eyes moving independently as he surveyed the returning students. His amphibious features revealed nothing. One by one, the names were called. Some were dismissed without comment. Others received brief nods of approval. A few received formal warnings for breaching protocol, wandering too far from drop zones, activating beacons prematurely, collapsing during construction due to poor energy planning. Then came Jack's name. He stepped forward and stood before the professor. Professor Tharn's top two eyes locked onto his, while the bottom pair studied the datapad held by his assistant. "Human," the professor said, his voice calm. "Your shelter registered the second highest internal thermal retention of all units." Jack didn't react. He waited. "You expended 76% of your power core. You used no prefabricated structures. You repurposed non-functional Terran equipment, and you brought another cadet into your shelter in defiance of the individual isolation directive." Jack drew breath. She was dying. "I had space. I made a call." Professor Tharn raised one thin, webbed finger. "You made two. You could have ignored the wreckage. You could have built from snow and hoped for the best. You didn't. You scavenged. You adapted. You disobeyed convention." He stepped forward and lowered his voice, though it carried clearly. "You passed with distinction, and the Academy has voted to formally record your shelter design in the survival database under experimental structures." Jack remained still. "You have also received an official commendation for field ethics, not for saving her life, but for risking your own with neither certainty nor instruction. That distinction is not given often." Behind him, Nira had been brought in on a med chair. She watched silently, her expression unreadable. The professor looked between them. "You may rest." Dismissed. Jack turned and walked away without a word. As he passed Nira, she reached out and grabbed his wrist. He paused, looked at her. "You didn't just build a shelter," she said. "You built a standard." He didn't answer, but he nodded. Later that evening, when the lights dimmed across the academy and the reports were filed, the recording of Jack's shelter was reviewed by a dozen instructors. It showed a shaky, patchwork dome stitched from what others had ignored. It showed heat flow, oxygen curves, oxygen-sharing algorithms he had improvised. And it showed one cadet lifting another from the snow and carrying her home. In the end, Jack sat alone in his bunk, staring at the stars through the viewport. He had built something to survive a night, but what he carried from that dome wasn't just the memory of cold wind and flickering coils. It was the knowledge that, in the middle of a test designed to measure endurance, he had chosen compassion. And that, he thought, was what made him human.